Well, everybody, welcome back to another week of Lecture Live. This week, we're kind of taking a step back from our normal art historical study, and we're focusing really on architecture and the church interior as a whole, which we will mention some works of art that are probably pretty familiar. If you are vaguely familiar with Renaissance art. So I want to welcome you to our lecture about the church interior. We will be focusing largely on Santa Maria Novella, which is a major church in Florence, although it's not Santa Maria del Fiore, which is the big church with, the Duomo that you so often associate with Florence. This is another major church, and it's very important because it's got some very important patrons, including the Strozzi family, the Medici family, kind of everybody, all the families that were really well-to-do throughout kind of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. So without further ado, I welcome you to the church interior. Now, we approach these churches, and I don't know how many of you have had a chance to go to Italy to be inside these churches or to be inside really Gothic churches as a whole. We do have a Gothic church in Washington, D.C., and I think we do have a Gothic church in New York City that's based off of, actual Gothic architecture. But on a whole, you really have to go to Europe to experience kind of architectural feats such as the Gothic cathedrals and Gothic churches. And Gothic is really how we categorize that medieval style of church. It's not quite classical, it's not Roman, but it's really strictly from a period, probably from 800, 900 to 1300s, 1400s, where Gothic churches are being built. And actually they have a bit of a renaissance or a bit of a revival later on in their lifetimes too. But when we go and look at these churches, they're largely open. So I got to study abroad in Arezzo, which was just about an hour outside of Florence. And when I went into Santa Maria Novella, I had no idea that the medieval church was much, much different from its modern form today. And really what we see today, although it doesn't totally mimic what would have been seen in the 17th century after kind of these reconstructions of medieval churches and medieval space, it is a little bit different. But this tells us that the interiors of churches are really studied as sacred spaces, both contemporarily and historically. But is what we see what congregants of the medieval era would have seen? And the short answer and the not complicated answer is no, but we're going to get a little complicated, of course, because it's Lecture Live. Churches have been subjects of renovation and redecoration really since their inception. We have documents going back to really maybe 50 to 100 to 150 years after these churches were originally built, to totally reconfiguring, well, not totally reconfiguring the space, but switching things up depending on congregational needs, depending on clerical or clergy needs. So it really depended on what communities used the space for. It was obviously a space to perform the Mass, the sacraments, everything that you would probably experience now within a Catholic church. But each community kind of had its own style of doing stuff, its own time. They would celebrate certain festivals, certain feast days, Assumption, all these things, Assumption Day, all these things would be celebrated in churches. But since they've been subject to really redecoration and renovation, what we experience today, like I said, is not often what people throughout history would have experienced. Now I'm showing you just a tidbit, just a teaser of Santa Maria Novella. And this is actually the high altar. And this is what is known as the Cappella Maggiore, or the major chapel, the biggest, the most important chapel. And these are all frescoes that you see. You can see the stained glass windows, and you can actually see a crucifix up here above the high altar. So this would not have been seen by mere plebeians such as us in the medieval church. So with that statement, uninhibited sight of the entire basilica, which is this church structure, including the high altar, was not the norm. So these spacious layouts where you can see everything, where you can see the crucifix, where you can see this high altar in the background, which is just, this is another viewing of what I showed you, but this is the entire basilica. And even to a great extent, the whitewashed walls, kind of almost sparse space and this huge open space. All of this was renovated really in the 16th century. And actually there were later renovations, I think, in the 19th century, but we'll kind of focus on the 16th century as well. Where we experience an open modern church, very inviting, very equalizing between the laity and everybody else, even the monks that are walking around. The medieval church featured barriers such as centralized choir stalls and tramezzi, which are also known as rood screens. Now, we're not really going to focus on choir stalls. Perhaps we'll do another lecture on those specifically, but we are going to focus on what these tramezzi were, or otherwise known as rood screens. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of those. There are still rood screens in existence in Gothic churches, but they largely exist in Northern Europe and have not been found in Italy, but we'll get to that. So we're going to focus on rood screens, what they are, and how we believe they impacted services in the medieval church. So rood screens have somewhat been, I wouldn't say ignored by scholarship, particularly in Italy. They've kind of been ignored, but they are experiencing a bit of a revival. So art historical studies have taught us that these are typical rood screens. And what you're seeing right here is this really gorgeous, pretty ornate barrier structure you see. But as you can see, it's very visible. Now you see this red rope, it's blocked off. This is what many art historians came to assume that all rood screens were, all tramezzos were. So I'll use rood screens and tramezzos, tramezzi, which is just Italian for the plural, interchangeably, but this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this almost wall-like structure, but it is an open space still, because you can still see the altar back here. Of course, this church has been changed up a little bit, but you can still see this centralized altar right here, and you can still see a table right back here. So although they're found in many Northern European churches, it's hard. A lot of art historical scholarship claim that they were not largely used in Italy, but this is not entirely correct. And really, it's not correct at all. Although there are examples of no documented evidence of rood screens in certain churches in Italy, they did in fact exist. But what are they and why were they used? Well, rood screens typically, now these are just a couple of more examples. This is actually quite creative. You actually see Christ being crucified, and you actually see, I think it's Barabbas and the other man being crucified by Christ. Anyway, so these are rood screens, and actually this kind of long structure across the top is called a ponte, which was it's a word for bridge in Italian. But what we can see that this kind of bridge-like structure is really pretty deep, while the screen itself is actually pretty shallow, right? You can walk through it, you can look through it, it's not inhibiting any sight. And you can kind of see a similar thing here. Now, this is a bit more ornate. It looks like it's probably got a couple of layers here, so makes visibility a little more challenging. But what they were typically used for is that they separated the church. And so when I say that we experience one church space, an open, aesthetically pleasing layout, the medieval church was actually separated into two separate churches. These tramezzos, or these rood screens, were meant to separate the laity and the clergy, or the monks, or the choir, or whoever was back there that was directly associated with the church, right? So not only was there a social hierarchy, because as we know, wealthy patrons got to come in pretty close to these root screens and actually got to go through these root screens on occasion. But that these sacred spaces, it was a market space between kind of the ordinary people and the spiritually elite, which would have been the clergy or the choir. And so that's really the main instance that it gave. Not only did it separate people kind of by social hierarchies and religious hierarchies, social status really, it also gave the monks or whoever was involved a place to prepare all the sacraments, right? To prepare for mass, to prepare for everything. And it actually gave them a place to store certain elements away from the eyesight of the laity or the lay people. And so not only was it a barrier of sort, but it was also pretty practical and pretty functional. And what is important to us is that it was essentially two different churches. Now, the problem with these rood screens, and not this one in particular, this one is another example. Now, the problem with these rood screens, though, is that it inhibited the sight of the lay people. So all the lay people did not have access to the high altar. They did not have access to the elements for mass, the wine, the bread. That was not taken by the lay people. They really were socially not condemned, but they were really separated from one of their most sacred acts in their faith. And this caused a bit of a stink, later with Martin Luther and Calvin and the Reformation. And it was actually a big factor in why I think the reformers kind of took the, religious stance that they did. But that's another lecture. So in Italy's major churches, particularly in Florence, there were once locations. Italy's major churches were once locations of these tramezzi, and their existence really changes how we study interaction between the church and its people. And just so you know, when I was an art history student in undergrad and college, this was not even well known, 6, 7, 8 years ago. When I was actually studying all this stuff, we were actually taught that these churches were really similar to what they would have been 500, 600, 700 years ago, but that's just not true. With the emerging of scholarship that these tramezzi existed, and particularly in major churches in Italy, it really is kind of a game changer in considering how these historical people approached art, how they approached this structure, what their chapels, what their individual altars looked like. It really changes the game. It changes everything. So clergy and laymen alike were subject to this type of barrier or wall within the church. But what do the existence of these tramezzi tell us about religious and social hierarchies? Well, they tell us that they existed, and that there was definitely an ideology throughout the church that the experience of the sacraments, the experience of Mass, was sometimes or was often too holy for normal lay people to exist, but the lay people could hear it. They just could not audibly, or they just could not visually partake in it like certain members of the church. And so here's another shot of Santa Maria Novella. And we historians such as Dr. Marcia Hall, Dr. Joanne Allen, and others really considered that these tramezzi were farther into the nave, so deeper. So this long space right here that you see, this is what's typically called the nave. They were deep into the church, which would allow a lot of congregants. These were massive Gothic churches, massive basilicas, but they allowed for a lot of people to come in and experience, whatever service happened to be taking place at the time. Now, on this floor plan, this is actually this is a structured floor plan done by Dr. Hall, who's actually my professor this semester, of a tramezzo and where it most likely would have been in Santa Maria Novella, which is this church we see on the left. And she's placed this tramezzo right here in these 1, 2, 3. So right here around this fourth pillar right here. And the back of it is right here, situated behind these pillars. So we've got the first wall of the tramezzo in the front and the second in the back. We actually have some stairs where you could go on the second level of this tramezzo. And she has done exceptional research on these things. She's actually the professor, the scholar that said, hey, I think something once existed here, and now she's kind of changed the game. But what this tells us is that this tramezzo, particularly in Santa Maria Novella and tramezzi in general, were typically deep structures. And in Santa Maria Novella, it was very deep, I think up to 6 feet, 8 feet. It was quite a big deal. And Dr. Hall has actually reconstructed what this barrier, this wall would have looked like. So this is what she believes based off of kind of what we have, certain pieces we have. We actually have this element right here in a museum. It's actually civic heraldry associated with a certain family. And I want to think it's St. George, or it's some sort of saint. Anyway, so according to various documentation and some elements that have survived that we believe were on the tramezzo itself, Dr. Hall has painstakingly reconstructed what she believes it would have looked like. Now, this tells us that there are 9 openings. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 openings on this first level, and then 6 openings on this next. And in this center, kind of this hole, is where Giotto's crucifix would have been. And the crucifix is actually still there. If you visit Santa Maria Novella, we're actually going to look at a better picture of it in just a second. But the crucifix would have hung down in the middle. So that tells us that lay people that were on this front side of the tramezzo, not on the back side, towards the high altar, but this front side, would have had something to look at. But scholars have also thought that on these tramezzos potentially were family altars, family chapels, and that some chapels might have been within the tramezzo itself, reserved particularly for wealthy patrons, right? You know, if you're rich, you can cross these barriers, right? But what this reconstruction does tell us is that there's no direct sight lines for the lay people to see the high altar. So this would have been 2 stories, right? So really, even if you were very tall, you would not have been able to witness the high altar. And maybe on certain occasions, you would have gotten a glimpse of the high altar through this kind of central opening, perhaps if you were very, very close. But the point was that the lay people couldn't see the high altar, but they could see Giotto's crucifix. So there is some consideration that the lay people are involved and are important to the overall health of the church, even though they are not technically allowed back into this very, sacred sanctioned space where the clergy would have been. So that being said, it's interesting what we can deduce about possible sight lines and were the laity visually impaired? Could they see the high altar? We've kind of covered that, and I kind of covered that in the previous slide. But just to give you a picture, this tramezzo would have started in between these piers right here. So kind of where these people are, you would not have been able to see that. In fact, there's documentation that somebody says, oh, now we can see these beautiful stained glass windows, which are actually what they're talking about right here, because they did not have access to, they may have had access and maybe could see this upper register of the stained glass, but they couldn't see this bottom register of the stained glass. And it really changes, I think, how we view these churches. And, in general, really, what was the whole point of it? And just in some of my research that I'm doing this semester, one of the major points is that there was always a type of barrier between kind of lay people, so the congregants, and people associated or working for the church, even in the older church. We don't have much evidence on house churches, so really the first 200 to 300 years after Christ died, those were considered house churches, and so they didn't have true meeting places, gathering places, which we would consider a church building, until right around 400, 415, 430 or so. And even in those earlier records, we are told that there were separate services, one for kind of everybody that was not a professing believer and one for professing believers. And so there was already starting to be kind of a religious social hierarchy in play. And so I think the Trimezzo, the Tremezzi, the rood screens are kind of an extenuation and evolving of kind of those barriers. And they were practical as well, because the clergy could do their thing and get all the sacraments ready and could store items. So this is kind of that reconstruction, but you can see it just a little bit better. So you can kind of see how deep this would have been. And actually, I was incorrect. Actually, this Trimezzo would have been, it probably would have been right back here. So these people are right in the dead center of the church, right in the dead center of where choir stalls would have been before they were replaced and put behind the high altar. So this space would not have been accessible. And the Trimezzo probably would have started, somewhere. It's either this stall or this stall. Anyway, I would have to take a better look. But we can kind of see this reconstruction that there was quite a bit of space back here. These would have been chapels, family chapels, that certain families had access to. And there would have been certain family altars actually featured on this Trimezzo itself. So this really tells us that church attendees, laymen, and even clergy had a vastly different experience of the church than we do. Jojo's crucifix would have been, like I said, centered above the Trimezzo, providing a visual for the layman not allowed beyond the screen. And so what is important, and what a scholar is actually looking into now, is if there was a possibility that certain lay people were allowed to kind of traverse or kind of go in between these screens. Were the monks accessible? Could they speak with the clergy? A lot of research is being done kind of on the social rules and what was allowed. But kind of for this lecture, we're kind of looking at, well, what did these congregants actually see? And so we need to think about the larger impact of how visitors experienced art within the medieval church, because a lot of this art was not seen by them. So Jojo's crucifix, I believe, is in the same place it's always been. It just would have been situated above the Trimezzo itself. So it tells us that it was quite a deep structure and had quite a lot of space behind it. Now, all of these frescoes in this high altar would have been experienced by the clergy. So they definitely would have had a special site because of their kind of religious associations with the church and their not social status, really religious status of being involved so much in the church, whether they were monks, whether they were clergy. What you just need to remember is they were very important religious people. And they would have had access to all these frescoes. So it makes you wonder, when patrons were commissioning such works, if a patron was commissioning it, because not all of these frescoes behind the Trimezzo were commissioned by the church itself, it makes you wonder, well, would a patron commission and spend all this money on these frescoes and not be able to see them? And the logical answer would be no, but we have to find evidence of that, right? But the logical answer would be that some people were allowed to go behind the Trimezzo, at the very least, to get to their chapels, to get to their particular altars that they had commissioned for the church and for themselves. And we actually know that burial spaces were found not only around the Trimezzo, because they used to bury people like in the ground in the church. That's where a lot of family tombs are located. You can actually find a lot of churches have crypts as well. But you can actually see that some individuals were actually buried behind the Trimezzo, which tells us that they probably had a family altar of some sort or had some sort of familial claim to that space, which tells us that these barriers, these rood screens, were a little bit more traversable. They were a little bit more accessible than we originally thought. So kind of throughout this brief study, we've really we've kind of stumbled upon a really complicated and a really interesting topic, but we really learned that the medieval church was experienced much differently than we experience churches today. And this has residual effects of what we can learn from historical people and their religious interactions as well. It's no small thing to learn that the medieval church was essentially split into two separate spheres. Now, I mentioned choir stalls. These choir stalls now are actually situated right around this high altar. So if you had a kind of a perspective and you could look farther down, that's where the church choir stalls are, which are exactly what they sound like. They're really just small square seats. Actually, they're pretty large square seats that the monks could, or the clergy could stand and sit depending on where they were at in the service. They used to be centralized. They used to be right behind the tramezzo, and then the high altar would come. And that would kind of be their normal kind of more medieval construction. So the big question, or the big thing that I want to leave you, is that this all started to really change in the this all started to change really in the 15th and 16th century, particularly after the Protestant Reformation and after the Council of Trent. But although the Council of Trent did hit on a lot of theological topics, they never had statements, or they never had mandates that these churches needed to be restructured to include everybody. In fact, we have documents stating that these tramezzi or these rood screens were actually being removed even in the 15th century, before the Protestant Reformation, before the Council of Trent. And so that kind of tells us a little bit of how taste and cultural needs were changing. Perhaps the laymen had complained. Perhaps they said, like, oh, let's open this space up so we can fit more people. It just depends. It just depends on the specific community that was there. And so, but it is interesting that these major renovations were, and particularly in Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce, which is another major church, that did happen after the Council of Trent. So you got to think that there must have been some sort of theological push. And in fact, in the north, obviously Catholic spaces were being taken over by Reformed Protestants, later Calvinists, and were reconfigured to kind of their specific needs. Everything was kind of being whitewashed. Pictures were being destroyed. We kind of call that the iconoclasm of the 16th century. But it's interesting that these churches were undergoing such major renovations. And it's a big political move and religious move to do such a thing in major churches such as Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce, which is what Cosimo de' Medici did. And Cosimo de' Medici was the de facto, he was the Duke of Florence. And so it is a very big political statement that he felt he had the power to come into this very religious space that he did not own and remove these barriers as well. So this really introduces us to a lot of very social, religious, and political questions. But I think the biggest thing that I want you all to learn from this is that we experience these churches much differently than the medieval people and the medieval church, the medieval people did within their own church. It was very much a kind of chaotic space, very much a separate space for laymen and clergy alike.